There is a specific kind of exhaustion that people-pleasing produces that no amount of rest addresses, not the tiredness of too much work. The specific, interior, accumulating depletion of a self that has been continuously available to everyone, for everything, in every moment that someone required something, for so long that the question of what the self itself actually needs has become genuinely difficult to answer, not because the need has disappeared, because the practice of attending to it has been so thoroughly subordinated to the practice of attending to everyone else's that access to it has become genuinely obscured. Gabor Maté spent his career observing the specific cost of chronic availability, not availability in the ordinary sense of being a responsive, caring, genuinely present person in relationship with others. The compulsive availability that cannot say no without the specific surge of anxiety that the word produces in a nervous system that learned, very early, that being needed was the most reliable available strategy for maintaining connection. This compulsive availability is not generosity. It can look like generosity from the outside. It can feel like generosity from the inside, particularly in the early years of its operation, when the rewards it generates, the appreciation, the being needed, the specific quality of being the person others can always count on, are sufficient to mask what it is actually costing. But it is not generosity in the genuine sense. Genuine generosity arises from surplus, from the specific quality of a self that has enough genuine interior resource, enough genuine self-care, enough genuine contact with its own actual needs, that offering to others is an expression of genuine abundance, rather than the systematic depletion of a resource that is never adequately replenished, because it is never adequately attended to. Compulsive availability arises from the wound, from the specific developmental conclusion that the self's worth is contingent on its usefulness, that belonging requires continuous demonstration of availability, that the moment of genuine rest, the moment when the self is not being useful, not being available, not being what someone else requires, is a moment in which the connection that makes existence bearable is at risk. Today I want to explore what happens on the day a person stops being available to everyone, not dramatically, not through the sudden, performed withdrawal of a self that has decided to prioritize itself in the language of the contemporary wellness culture, but genuinely, in the specific, quiet, deeply personal way that genuine change in this territory actually occurs, what that day requires, what it produces, and what becomes available on the other side of it that the compulsively available self could never access from inside its continuous availability. The first thing that needs to be understood is why the stopping is so difficult. The compulsive availability is not simply a habit, it is a nervous system state. The specific, physiologically real activation that occurs when the availability is withdrawn, when the no is said, when the request is declined, when the self is not immediately present for whatever is being asked of it. That activation is not simply social discomfort. It is the nervous system's accurate reproduction of the specific threat that the original environment associated with unavailability. In the original environment, the specific early relational context in which the compulsive availability was formed, unavailability produced genuine consequences. The withdrawal of warmth, the disruption of connection, the specific, painful, entirely non-hypothetical outcome of a relational environment in which the self's availability was the condition of its belonging. The adult nervous system does not automatically distinguish between that original context and the current one. When the availability is withdrawn in the adult relational environment, however genuinely different that environment may be from the original, the nervous system generates the same activation it learned to generate in response to the original threat. The anxiety, the guilt, the specific urgent sense that something important is at risk that must be restored as quickly as possible. This is why the stopping is so difficult, not because the current relationships actually require the compulsive availability, but because the nervous system is running a threat assessment calibrated to an environment that no longer exists in the same form, and responding to the current moment with the full physiological conviction of a system that learned its lesson in circumstances where that lesson was genuinely necessary. Understanding this genuinely at the level where it can be felt rather than simply acknowledged changes the relationship with the difficulty of stopping. The anxiety that arises when availability is withdrawn is not accurate information about the current relational environment. It is the nervous system's faithful reproduction of the original environment's requirements, and faithful reproduction of an outdated threat assessment, however physiologically convincing, is not the same as genuine present danger information. The second thing that needs to be understood is what the compulsive availability is actually costing. Not the obvious costs, the exhaustion, the resentment that accumulates below the surface of continuous giving, the specific quality of depletion that eventually produces the breakdown, or the illness, or the sudden inexplicable inability to continue. Those costs are real, and they are significant. But there is a deeper cost that is less often named: the cost to the self's relationship with itself. The person who is continuously available to everyone has, by structural necessity, made themselves consistently unavailable to their own genuine interior experience. The attention that is always directed outward, toward what someone else needs, what the room requires, what the next request will be, is attention that is not available for the honest, patient, genuinely important work of attending to what is actually present in the self's own interior life. Over time, this consistent self-unavailability produces a specific and significant consequence. The self's own needs, desires, genuine responses to genuine experience. These become increasingly difficult to access, not because they have disappeared, because the practice of attending to them has been so consistently subordinated to the practice of attending to everyone else's that the pathway to them has become genuinely obscured. Gabor Maté observed this with clinical consistency in the people whose compulsive availability had been operating long enough to produce its most significant interior consequence. The person who cannot answer honestly, from genuine interior contact rather than from the socially appropriate approximation, what they actually feel, what they actually want, what they actually need. Not because they are withholding, because the genuine access has been genuinely diminished by years of consistent self-unavailability. The stopping is not only about having more time and more energy, it is about recovering access to the self that the continuous availability has been covering. The third thing that needs to be understood is what the day of genuine stopping actually looks like. It does not look like the dramatic withdrawal that the internal narrative of a self that has been suppressing resentment for years might imagine. It does not look like the sudden announcement of new limits, the reclamation of self in the language of empowerment, the visible reorganization of the life around newly declared priorities. It looks quiet. It looks like a single moment, often unremarkable from the outside, in which the habitual yes is not immediately produced, in which the space between the request and the response is, for the first time, genuinely occupied by something other than the automatic generation of availability, in which the self's own actual response to the request, whatever that response actually is allowed to be present, however briefly, before the anxiety about disappointing produces the familiar accommodation. That moment, the specific, small, genuinely significant moment of pausing before the automatic yes, is the day the stopping begins. Not the day it is complete. Not the day the compulsive availability is resolved. The day the genuine self's response is allowed to be present in the space between request and reply. And from that moment, if it is met with genuine curiosity, rather than immediately suppressed by the returning anxiety, something begins to develop. The capacity to inhabit the pause, to stay in the space between request and response long enough for the genuine self's actual assessment to become available, to discover in that space what the response actually is when it is not automatically generated by the nervous system's threat assessment about the consequences of unavailability. Now, I want to give you the 7 specific things that become available when the compulsive availability genuinely begins to reduce. The first is genuine energy. Not the energy of someone who has rested more efficiently, the specific quality of energy that becomes available when it is no longer being continuously redirected outward before it can be registered as available for anything else. The energy that was always being consumed by the monitoring function, the continuous, largely automatic scanning of the relational environment for what is needed, what is expected, what would be most welcome, becomes gradually available for something different, for genuine creative engagement, for genuine rest, for the specific quality of interior attention that genuine self-knowledge requires. The second is genuine desire. The compulsively available self has very often lost reliable access to its own genuine desires, not preferences about small things. The deeper, more fundamental sense of direction, what the genuine self is actually drawn toward, what it would choose if the choice were genuinely its own, rather than organized around what would be most welcomed by the people whose regard it has been managing. As the compulsive availability reduces, this access begins, gradually and imperfectly, to return. The genuine desire becomes more audible beneath the management of other people's desires. The direction that is genuinely the self's own becomes more visible beneath the accommodation of everyone else's directions. The third is genuine presence in the relationships that remain. One of the paradoxes of compulsive availability is that it prevents genuine relational presence. The self that is continuously available is never fully present, because the continuous availability requires the continuous management of what is being offered, calibrated to what the other person needs, filtered through the monitoring function that is always assessing the relational temperature before the genuine self is allowed to enter the room. As the compulsive availability reduces, something becomes possible in relationship that the availability prevented. Genuine presence. The specific, unmanaged, genuinely alive quality of a self that is actually in the room rather than managing its own appearance in the room. The relationships that can hold this, that welcome the genuine self rather than only the managed version, become considerably more sustaining, and the relationships that cannot hold it reveal themselves with greater clarity than was previously available as relationships that were organized around the availability rather than around the person. The fourth is genuine rest. Not the rest that is permitted after sufficient productivity, not the rest that is taken with the specific quality of someone waiting for it to be over so that the availability can resume. Genuine rest. The specific, embodied, actually restorative experience of a nervous system that is not required to maintain the monitoring function, that is allowed to genuinely stand down, that can actually return to baseline because the threat assessment that kept it running, the specific alarm system that treated unavailability as danger, has been, even temporarily, genuinely quieted. The fifth is genuine self-knowledge. The self that has been continuously available to everyone has had very little opportunity to be genuinely available to itself. The honest, patient, genuinely curious attention to the interior life that genuine self-knowledge requires. What am I actually feeling? What do I actually think? What does my own genuine response to this situation actually tell me? This kind of interior attention has been consistently preempted by the outward monitoring that compulsive availability requires. As the compulsive availability reduces and genuine interior attention becomes more available, genuine self-knowledge begins to develop in ways that years of outward focus prevented, not immediately, not dramatically, but genuinely in the small and ordinary moments of genuine self-attention that the reduction of compulsive availability makes room for. The sixth is genuine discernment about what actually matters. The compulsively available self tends to treat all requests as equally legitimate because the nervous system's threat assessment does not discriminate between requests that are genuinely important and requests that are simply present. The anxiety about saying no applies equally regardless of the significance of what is being asked. As the compulsive availability reduces and genuine discernment becomes possible, something clarifies about what actually matters, which relationships are genuinely sustaining versus which ones are primarily organized around the availability they have come to expect, which obligations are genuinely aligned with the self's actual values versus which ones are present simply because they have never been questioned, which investments of time and energy produce genuine return versus which ones are consuming resources that the compulsive availability never permitted to be evaluated honestly. The seventh thing, the one that Gabor Maté considered most fundamental: the day you stop being available to everyone is the day you become genuinely available to yourself. And genuine availability to yourself is the precondition for genuine availability to anyone else, not the performed availability of the compulsively available self. The genuine availability of a person who has enough genuine interior resource, enough genuine self-knowledge, enough genuine contact with their own actual experience, that what they offer to others arises from genuine surplus rather than from the continuous depletion of a resource that is never adequately attended to. This is the specific paradox at the center of the compulsive availability's cost. The person who is available to everyone is, in the deepest sense, available to no one. Because the self that is continuously managed, continuously calibrated to what the room requires, continuously filtered through the monitoring function's assessment of what would be most welcome, that self is not actually present in the relationship, it is performing presence while being genuinely elsewhere. The self that has developed genuine availability to itself, that has the interior resource, the self-knowledge, the genuine contact with its own experience that comes from the day the compulsive availability began to genuinely reduce. That self brings something qualitatively different to its relationships, not less, more genuinely present, more honestly itself, more capable of the specific quality of genuine relational contact that the managed, continuously available version of the self could never produce. And the privilege of a lifetime, the one Gabor Maté pointed toward with everything he had across 50 years of sitting with human beings at the full honest depth of their most genuine experience. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not the version that was always available to everyone, the version that is finally, genuinely available to itself. That version has something real to offer, something that the compulsive availability, for all its faithfulness and all its genuine care, could never quite provide.